Ani bonjour, everybody. My name is Bailey Walkie. I'm the founder of Frayed Feathers and the host of the Frayed Feathers podcast. Miigwech for donating your time with me today. And I'm so sorry for not having a podcast last week. My dog ate my homework. But no, on the real though, she did eat my power cord for my beatbox looper, which is what I use for a mixer. A mixer is kind of what you see here, actually crudely set up in the corner of the screen. And yeah, so nonetheless, we are back up and running, but the power cord to my beatbox looper is a lot harder to replace in a timely manner. So your boy went and got this situated. So anyway, you didn't come here to worry about my power supply problems. You came here for youth reconciliation. So today we are talking about coaching young Indigenous policy leaders, okay? A very specific stream of leadership in the Indigenous youth space. And I feel that this is something that I can talk about because I'm a youth policy analyst. I started as a dance teacher whenever I was a kid. That was where I was exposed to kind of like the magic of community work and working with young people. I did that for 4 years. I've been dancing since I was like a very, very small baby, and then moved to Toronto from Cornwall, Ontario. Did my social service worker diploma. Worked frontline social work in downtown Toronto for like 4 years. Worked at shelters. Worked in restorative justice. And now I work as a policy analyst, so I feel like I can really bring and speak to the lived experience as well as the support experience of working on the front line. And so now I work in the policy field, trying to create strategies, frameworks, programs that are going to support young Indigenous people to the best of their abilities, right? And so reconciliation is a big part of this. And yes, so going into the topic today, excuse me. So why would you want to do this? Why would you want to coach young Indigenous policy leaders? Well, first of all, representation. We need young people serving young people, and by extension, if we consider for Indigenous by Indigenous, we also need that, right? So if we want Phoebe for Indigenous by Indigenous, we also need to bring that premise to young people as well. Young Indigenous people serving young Indigenous people. And in the policy sector, you need to get more young Indigenous people involved in the sector. Second reason, succession planning. I'm sorry to say this, but you're not going to be around forever, saying it to myself as well in the mirror. We won't be here forever. We need someone to replace us. And so that's why we invest in our future leaders, so that whenever it does come our time, unfortunately, we are confident that we have a succession plan in place and somebody can take over our initiatives. Number 3, return on time investment. Okay, 1 hour of mentoring now is 10 hours of self-research. Okay, because it's not as simple as Googling something, seeing the right answer, and being like, oh, that's great. If you're self-researching, you don't have the expertise. You don't know the varying opinions. You don't know what people agree with and disagree with and what their reasonings are. And so it's going to take you many more hours to not only find the answer, but then also find out what people in the sector think about the answer, and so anyway, so yeah, that's what I mean. Like 1 hour of mentoring somebody who already has all this information organized and ingrained in their brain, they can quickly put a young Indigenous person on the right path. And so they don't have to go through all these hours of research, down rabbit holes that didn't actually lead anywhere. And yeah, so, it's really important to manage or to respect their time, because their time will compound. The more mentoring you give them now, the more exceptional they will be as a leader later, okay? Think about how many opinions you need to hear just to know you're having the right conversation online. You know what I mean? Like, you're just sifting through so much BS, bro. Like, you just like go on Reddit and you're just like, does this person even understand the question in the first place? You know what I mean? And so that's what I mean. You're removing the need for young people to go through all that stuff. So return on time investment, reason number 3. So that's all great. That's why we do it. But why is it hard? Okay, what are the challenges to doing this? Number 1, in my opinion, very few policy jobs that do not require high education. I think it's standard practice for policy analysts to have a master's degree. And me personally, I only have a college diploma, but I had a lot of lived experience. I worked frontline. I intimately understand the experience of somebody going through government systems of care. In my context of being a social policy analyst, somebody who works in the nonprofit sector, a lot of my skills are transferable. And so, I say, nay, I don't think you need a master's to do this. And honestly, I think that going through the institution of higher education kind of like makes your brain think a certain way. You know what I mean? And like, I've, I haven't, like, I don't feel like I've been unsuccessful in my position, without the master's. So, yeah, so like, it's a huge buy-in. So that's why it's hard. There's like you require so much time and money investment just to get to a point where you can actually apply for jobs. So a master's is great, but like you also need to consider what are the lived experiences and like kind of what else can inform someone's career path. So anyway, so that's reason number one. Number two, young Indigenous people are born into a political discussion that no one tells them how to communicate about. So another way to see this is that, young Indigenous people are problem aware. They know that colonization is bad. They don't want to be in this system. It's discriminatory, whatever. Okay. But that doesn't mean that they are solution aware. They know that there's a problem, but they don't know how to address it. And so, like when you go online, you often see other young Indigenous people or just advocacy groups, whatever, like they're talking about climate change and resource management and, like vulnerable youth support advocacy, like, oh, my friend's getting kicked out of their landlord's or their house because their landlord's being discriminatory because of their sexual orientation, sign this petition, all this stuff. But here's the thing, like, like these things are kind of like what's around schools, right? So like when we think of just like advocacy, I think young people are commonly exposed to these two different categories of advocacy, right? So it's like vulnerable young people because, maybe their friends are vulnerable, maybe they're vulnerable. I know this is how I got into it, being a one of the very few Indigenous people in a very, very Catholic school in Cornwall, Ontario. And so anyway, and then, the other part of it is like climate change, resources and stuff, like natural resources management, like we all had the, in my generation, anyway, we had the reduce, reuse, recycle thing, reduce, reuse, recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle. We had like this little like TV show that comes up, along with Milk Day, LOL propaganda, so it's like, there's so much of these. This is how you naturally get exposed into policy, right? Like, oh, regulations, government mandating, this is how we this is how we do the recycling stuff, whatever. Okay. But here's the thing, like that's all you get. You just get exposure to these different things, you know what I mean? These different items that you can focus your advocacy on like trying to change. But, like we need to, as professionals, differentiate what is a service challenge and what's a systemic challenge, right? So if we consider, the vulnerable youth example, is this youth vulnerable because they lack services? They lack nonprofits there to support them. They lack the government to support them in whatever which way. Or is it a systemic challenge where we are enabling people, young people, to be discriminated via whatever discriminatory practice it is, you know what I mean? Like in this case of the landlord, someone discriminating for their sexual orientation, maybe the landlord is not explicitly saying like, you're gay, I don't want you in my household, but like, it's quite clear that that's how they feel or something, like, we really need to kind of be able to unpack the situation and say like, is it our policies, our legislation, whatever, our government systems that are enabling people to find themselves in a level of precarity, or is it that youth just needs more support from their community members, right? And so, this is kind of where we run into this like conversation about policy and where kind of I have a hard time engaging with young people sometimes, not all the time, but it's just like, they are exposed to policy from a different angle. And I don't think that that angle is the systemic part of it. You know what I mean? It's almost always about the service, right? Hey, government, if you did this better, if you made more allocations, if you funded these kinds of programs, then you would we would have a better social outcomes, which makes sense. But the reason why we have these situations happening, like where we have to advocate for them to change, is because of policy authorities. It's because the system, quote unquote, the policies like that are implementing these, or that are the programs that are coming out of the policies that are in Canada. Those programs are set out to do specific things, and those specific things are leaving out some of young Indigenous people, or what we call gaps in the system, right? And so, like, this is what I mean. Like, it's not about changing the service, because the service is doing what it's supposed to do. You know what I mean? Like, when government looks at the reporting, what they set out the program to do, it's probably going to do that quite effectively, despite it having gaps. Okay. But my whole thing is like, if we're going to engage young Indigenous leaders into the sector, we need to move them past that conversation and say, look, yes, this is what's happening on the ground level, and that's bad. Let's continue our advocacy efforts. But what you need to do as a young Indigenous policy leader, you need to look at the oversight. You need to look at the things on the higher level and say, what is allowing these gaps in service to occur, right? And so that's the difference between the policy discussion and the service discussion. And that kind of further boils down into, like, youth are problem aware, but not solution aware. And policy is a solution to that, right? Okay, moving on. Why it's hard. Reason number 3. So, like, if we consider the premise of somebody having a master's education to get into being a policy analyst, then there's no other streamlined processes for young Indigenous people to get into policy. Like, it's like you go to school, you get education, or you go to school for what, like 4 and then 2 years plus your high school. So like you're in there for about 12 years. Well, let's say post-secondary, you're in there at least 6 minimum if you go like straight through, which, let's be honest, most people drop out, come back, life happens, life's complicated. Anyway, so, you have to go through this 6-year process and multiple hundreds, tens of thousands of dollars later. And that's just to get into the conversation. So now, if we consider no other streamlined process for young people to get into policy, then we as professionals in the sector need to begin intercepting them and onboard them into a learning journey about policy. Okay. And like, let me just give some stats here real quick, just to like really point this out of like how difficult it is, like how unreasonable it is to expect young Indigenous people to get into policy via a higher level education. So here I'm on Stats Canada. I will put this link in the description. You can check out whatever I'm reading. So basically, I'm just going to read this out for you and then kind of give some commentary. So here it says, quote, just under 2/3, 63% of all, This is First Nations, mainly because First Nations are so much easier to write stats about. Like the word Indigenous is kind of ambiguous. I won't get into all that, but yeah, this is First Nations. This is does not include Métis and Inuit people. This is just First Nations. All right. So, quote, just under 2/3, 63% of all First Nations youth had completed high school in 2015-2016 school year, compared with 91% of non-Indigenous population. First Nation youth living off reserve were more likely to get their high school diploma at 73%, that's 10% more, than First Nations youth living on reserve, 46%. Oh, I read that wrong. Yeah. So basically, like, this kind of comes down to access, right? Like on the reserve, like a lot of youth don't actually have a high school on the reserve. They need to go out off the reserve for that. And so, like there's already barriers for First Nations youth on reserve to just get to high school. Okay. And then not only considering all the societal, systemic, and personal challenges a young Indigenous person might be going through. And, so if we try to think about post-secondary, here, quote, First Nations youth were also less likely to have completed or recently attended a post-secondary program than non-Indigenous youth, which is 37% versus 72. Okay. And this stat doesn't include, this stat does include not only completed, but also recently attended. Okay. This is just if you've gone into the program. Like, it's astonishing. Anyway, so basically, like, what I'm saying is, like, to expect young Indigenous people to like just hurrah into policy via getting a master's degree is just totally unreasonable. Like sure, it might happen for a few, but let's be honest, like, we have to find other ways to do it. Okay. And in my opinion, I was mentioning earlier, young Indigenous people are born into a political discussion that they don't know how to communicate about. They're very problem aware. They hear it in their circles all the time. Their uncles, their aunties, their grandmas, they're talking about the government. They keep a pulse on what's going on. Bro, whenever I became a policy analyst and started telling my my uncles about what's going on in the world, or just like Canada, I should say, I was shocked at how much they understood my job. You know what I mean? And it's just because they keep an eye on the news. They knew what the United Nations Indigenous Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was, UNDRIP, from the United Nations. They knew what DRIPA was, the Declaration of Rights Indigenous Peoples Act. In Canada, they knew that BC was the first one to implement DRIPA. Like all these amazing things that I usually have to like explain to other policy analysts about the Indigenous experience. My uncle who works in a warehouse knew about. You know what I mean? Like, and so anyway, like, I don't think that we require people to have a master's. We just need to create the environment for them to begin learning about this in their own which way. Okay. And so the way we do that is like we create events, we give them honorariums, we create group circles, we do long-term mentoring engagements, and the crux of all this is that it all costs money. And, it costs money for only the prospect that we motivate some young people. But like, that's a risk I'll take every day, because I know, as a young Indigenous person who's passionate about this work, I've had way too much coffee apparently today. I know that these circles exist because I'm leading strategies, and I've engaged these circles. I see the engagement. Like, dude, like in this program I'm leading right now, at the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, we just filled up a workshop about the state of Indigenous youth housing, like within like 3 hours. Okay. Like, that's 35 people. And yeah, we're giving an honorarium. They're going to get some money for going, but like, all these people had to get into our Discord server before they signed up. So these people got into the Discord server with no prospect of like getting anything, just using it as a learning resource. So, the sector is completely underserved, and like there's a real appetite to learn about this stuff, but nobody's giving them the opportunity to do it. And so we need to do that more. Okay. So getting into the implementation, how we do it, getting into the solutions, let's go. All right. So how we do it, number one, you need to go to where the game is being played, okay? Excuse me, I had to get some water. Mouth is a desert. All right. So you need to find local youth advisory committees and create an irresistible offer to them, okay? These young people have already committed to advocacy programs, and therefore they understand the need and value of what you're offering them. You don't need to present to them what you're giving. Like, they see it and they're like, wow, that's awesome. Okay. Number three, our third point to going to where the game is played. Young people want mentorship and support, but they will not disrespect themselves to get it. They've come way too far to take on a half-baked offer. Okay. Like, what I mean by this is like young Indigenous people who are in advocacy circles, they're punctual, they've got the life skills, they're maybe going to school, they're doing, quote unquote, the life stuff, the adulting that they're supposed to do. Dude, you as the listener must consider that these young Indigenous people probably went through a lot. They probably found themselves in deep levels of need in multiple stages of their life, and they deserve respect for not only getting out of that, but then also thinking to themselves, I want to make it better so the next generation doesn't have to deal with what I had to deal with. And that's why they're in that advocacy circle. Okay. They have clearly made their commitment to the community already upon you entering. Okay. You didn't need to like go out and create a leader to like get them involved. Like these young Indigenous people are already in the thick of it, and like they care about this work. They're willing to address their personal traumas so that they don't like get re-triggered by all these things that they're working through in these advisory circles. Okay. Like where I'm getting at is like these youth deserve to be given an irresistible offer, and they're not going to disrespect themselves for anything less. Okay. Okay. And so, last point on this, like what I'm describing is myself, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to speak for other people, but there's a lot of, folks out there that would love to have an Indigenous youth, leader in their space just to like give them like tokenized input and things like this. But it's like, I'm not here for that. Like I'm trying to go to the next level. I want to move past tokenistic engagements. I want to be a leader for other sector stakeholders to engage youth in the way we do. Like I don't want to get an honorarium, some bus tickets, and maybe a gift card at the end of like 3 hours of engaging with somebody. That's not a real offer. Okay, but what is a real offer is number 2, be willing to invest in the long term. Okay. It will take time for young people to receive your message. They need time to reflect and hear it a couple times for it to sink in. But they've already but like to the point earlier, they've already demonstrated that like they understand the value, but like you need to give them the opportunity to just like think it over, and like challenge it a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, and I feel like this can get frustrating, especially because so much prep goes into mentoring somebody, right? So just like, I think it's one of those things where you have to be mindful that young people, despite understanding the value and all that stuff, like they will need time. They want to understand you as a mentor. You know what I mean? Like, like in giving them, like taking the opportunity, that's great. But like now, like in mentoring them, yeah, I guess I should have said it that way. So it's like you've made the offer to them. They're like, okay, cool, this is great. But like once you're in the actual like mentoring part of it, you need to be willing to invest in the long term. So like just accept that like young Indigenous people in policy discussions, you're bringing them into a very complicated and complex conversation. They want to understand you, okay, but it's going to take time. Like sometimes they just can't. And, this is why we expect people to go through a master's degree for them to get to a point where they can just enter policy discussions and get to going. You know what I mean? But you are trying to offer them a different process to do that. And so like, yeah, you don't need to provide a master's quote unquote level of education to these youth. But like if somebody's taking 6 years just to enter a conversation, like you best be willing to invest in the long term for them to understand and fully wrap their head around your specific challenges in the policy sector, right? So if you want high quality feedback from them, you're going to have to invest long term with them. You can't meet with them twice over the course of a month and be like, this is great. You know what I mean? Like every single week you need to be on them. If they have a group, add in a group session after that. You're putting in exercises in between. You're showing them development on a project live. We go to this stage, or maybe even smaller. This segment of the process, we need to do a lot of meetings. I'm going to teach y'all how to do a pre-meeting briefing note. We're going to walk you through this process. This is how you make talking points. This is how you sound smart, whatever. Anyway, so with this in mind, investing in the long term, we're doing something new here. You need to be ready to adjust your expectations about results. The fact that a young Indigenous person is taking the opportunity is already a success. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, these youth are going through so much. There's so much things that they could be focusing on, but they've decided to focus in on this policy mentoring opportunity that you've offered them. This this fake imaginary premise we're talking about here. So anyway, so yes, it's already a success for them to take it, and now it's more about managing your expectations about your ability to teach people. Okay, like the amount of times I've been teaching a youth like dance, beatbox, policy, and to me it seems so clear, right? But it seems so clear because I have hours and hours of context, right? I've experimented, I've like tested theories, I'm reading books, right? Like, in dance, I've moved that way like hundreds, maybe even thousands of times. And so, yeah, so like it's more, in the mentoring, it more becomes about how effective you are as a teacher rather than how effective they are as a student. So be mindful of that. So, and then secondly, or lastly, to this point, being invested in the long term, you need to consider that this opportunity, this mentoring opportunity you're giving youth, this is a process in and of itself. Like they are learning things just by committing to this process. So for example, like they're staying accountable, they're learning interpersonal communication, like between a mentor and mentee. A mentee might say a lot of stuff that the mentor it just doesn't click. You know what I mean? Like it's not coming out clearly. Maybe the mentee is using some words that like don't like that are like it's the discourse of the sector, but it's not quite like doesn't quite make sense in the way that they think it does. And so, they're learning that interpersonal communication. Okay, taking like my ideas in my brain and saying them, my mentor is not understanding me. I need to adjust. I need to find different adjectives. I need to refine the way I talk about things. And yeah, so that's a skill. Like you're learning how to do that. That's really hard. That's a lifetime of expertise, is learning how to say things in a way that people understand you. Another part of this, they're experimenting with setting boundaries. Maybe the mentor, you're asking too much of them. They don't even, and you don't even realize it because maybe the youth is like, yeah, I'll do that. I'll read that book. I'll make that piece of paper. I'm going to whip up that document. I'm going to create that outline for you next week. But what they don't realize is that like that work was actually a lot more than they thought. Or maybe they knew it was way too much work in the beginning, but they didn't feel comfortable saying no, and so they, in this exercise of you mentoring them, they're experimenting with setting boundaries. Maybe they get slightly better at setting boundaries next time. They say no to one of the four things, you know what I mean? But it was still too much. Okay, well, they're experimenting. Now they know, okay, I can only do 3 things a week. Maybe they couldn't even do that. Okay, I can do 1 thing a week, And that is an invaluable thing to teach somebody in addition to the content you're teaching them. Okay, so it's not just about the content, the discourse, the learning objectives of the youth. It's also about allowing them the space to learn all these soft skills that go along with having a working relationship, and mind you, if it's long term, like a quality working relationship, right? Like honestly, like most professionals that I know don't actually have mentors, you know what I mean? They just went to school, they got in, and maybe they naturally like gravitate towards their manager or a different manager, a leadership in their organization, but they're not like an official mentor, you know what I mean? So so you need to be mindful that like youth are just getting into this type of relationship, and just be okay and happy with them learning the soft skills of staying accountable, interpersonal communication, setting boundaries. And don't be harsh. You know what I mean? Like if one of my youths doesn't make a meeting and they only tell me 10 minutes after the meeting started, okay, that's all right. I'll just reschedule for next week. And really what I'm hoping for is not that I'm not hoping to Dearest that they show up and all this and that. What I'm hoping is that if they don't show up, they reschedule within a week. You know what I mean? Because if they start like blowing it off, then I might be like, this is bad. You know what I mean? They're not staying motivated to the thing. But sometimes youth just mismanage their calendar, and like, and they're like, hey, let's do it tomorrow. And you're like, okay, cool. We'll do it tomorrow. Sweet. And, Don't make them feel weird about it whenever they show up either, okay? So, number 3, and how we're going to begin landing the plane on this podcast episode, is work on a project with them and use it as a learning experience. Okay? So say you want to create a youth service framework, excuse me, where you outline how young people need to be supported by your organization. Okay? So you want to create that document, that deliverable, with your young mentees over the course of the long term. So you want to show them live, you know what I mean? Like you want to, in the ideation phase, when you're engaging internal staff members, when you're having meetings with external stakeholders that are still relevant to your organization. I work in an association, so we have members, engaging those members, bring the youth into those opportunities, like bring them into the meetings just so they can see that these meetings are really just conversations. Like it's not like some well-oiled machine, and when we say like the system, it's going to like a specific thing's going to happen when we do this and that. Like no, it's actually just people, and people are complex. You don't know what people are going to do. They're unpredictable. And so so use these all the way from the ideation to the goal setting to the actual execution, bring them into all these different stages of the process and allow them to see what goes into a finished product within policy. Next part of this, from start to finish, meet with them weekly and give them the responsibility of pre-reading each draft so they can offer feedback. Okay, so each time that you meet with them, they would have pre-read the material, and you're going to be able to offer them very fast answers to the questions they have. And also, if they read it and they didn't understand it, then you can offer the mentoring to fill in that gap in understanding. The more, if you ever feel that your youth's feedback is not helpful, then you need to work with them to make it helpful. Okay? It's not the youth's incompetency to engage in policy that is the barrier. It's that they don't know how to communicate about the challenge you're experiencing. So, they're not offering you poor feedback. They're offering you what they know. And it's up to you to increase or add to what they already know. So, last point to this, you want to provide as much context as possible to their input and what may come out of it, because each time they hear it, they'll be enhancing their professional opinion about the topic you're teaching. Okay, so for example, if you're like, hey, we're going to create this program, and then they say, oh, I would love for this thing to be part of the program. I don't know, maybe I'm trying to think of a thought experiment. Let's say, oh, I would love to engage youth about their lived experience so that we can inform this process more. Well, what I would say to that as a youth policy analyst is that the nonprofit sector has been telling the government what's wrong for decades. And in my opinion, it's not going to be very effective to do a needs assessment on what this vulnerable demographic is experiencing, because I can pull relative data out of the thousands of gray literature that is coming out of nonprofits every other day. And by extension, academic studies, go looking into the more specific parts of government systems, you can use the gray literature in combination with the more accredited stuff like academics, and really just kind of build out this experience of what it's like for this vulnerable demographic. You don't need to go re-engage them about personal stories that are going to hurt their heart and mind from telling. You know what I mean? As a youth policy analyst, I'm so over hearing sob stories, and I have my own sob stories, but I don't want to tell it. You know what I mean? It's about supporting the youth to make the change for themselves. Okay, we want to move past doing these typical engagements that are just tokenistic in nature by asking people, how bad was it whenever you were traumatized by a government system of care, So, if you want to coach young Indigenous leaders, the reason why you do it is for representation. It's important for young Indigenous people to be served by young Indigenous people, for Indigenous, by Indigenous. You need succession planning in this world because someone's going to have to take over your reconciliation initiatives. And then lastly, return on time investment, because time is their most valuable resource. Our time is all of our most valuable resource, and youth are looking for ways to spend their time in the best way they can. All right. Subscribe to my newsletter. It's down in the description. I say it's every week, but I might go to 2 weeks. I don't know. I want to bring in as much value as I can to it. So check me out on LinkedIn. That's also in the description. That's my main platform for vibing out and just kind of posting my content. Big things in the works. I mean, everyone's going to say that, and then it turns out to be like a sticker or something like that. But I've got accepted into doing a couple opportunities, and so I'm really interested to know or to learn how I can bring what I can bring from learning about those opportunities. I'm saying nothing, I'm realizing, and love y'all. Peace.